The day of my daughter's cancer treatment, the hospital called saying the spot was given to a better match. I sighed. This was the third cancellation. I kept driving anyway, and while Amelie was in the waiting room, I was curled up crying on the bathroom floor. That's when a nurse walked in and locked the door behind her. I could lose my job for this, but someone made a call to our department head. They told them you're putting Amelie through unnecessary procedures for attention. Who? I could barely get the word out. I don't know, but they said they were family. They had all your information, knew about Amelie's condition, her history. My phone buzzed. It was Michael, my ex-husband. Hey, I know things have been tough with the appointments. If you need help managing the schedule, just let me know. Thanks, but we're handling it fine. Good. Well, I'm here if you need me. His voice had that practiced concern he'd perfected during the divorce. I hung up and slumped in the waiting room chair, hoping they could squeeze us in despite the cancellation. A woman with twin boys looked over with a grin. Are you and Michael back together? I saw him here this morning. My blood went cold. Michael was here? When? The woman shifted uncomfortably. Maybe I was mistaken. No, I said quietly, the pieces clicking together. No, I don't think you were. I dropped off Amelie at my sister's house and drove straight to his office. His secretary's face instantly went pale when she saw me. He said if you come by to tell you he's in a meeting. She couldn't look at me. He's actually at lunch with his wife. I stormed out and drove around town looking for him. I knew that fruity fucker was probably sipping some pumpkin spice rainbow latte. And I was right. His new wife Lauren sat in their Lexus, feeding their baby organic pouches while he ordered Starbucks. You're interfering with her treatment. My voice was shaking. He turned around and smiled. That same smile he'd given the judge during our custody hearing. You're being dramatic again. Someone has to protect her from your hysteria. She's 8 years old, Michael. She still sleeps with the bear you gave her. She's suffering. He said it like he was ordering coffee. This is kinder. Lauren rolled down her window. Quality of life matters more than quantity. Maybe this is nature's way of saying you should let go. I left before I said anything they could use against me in court. That night my lawyer called. There's a life insurance policy on Amelie worth $500,000. If she dies under the age of 10 from a terminal illness, it pays double. I threw up in my kitchen sink. This wasn't impulse or panic about medical bills. Amelie was his cash cow. The next morning, while in the waiting room, we were talking to a girl her age when her dad came up to her. After the medicine, we can get ice cream, he promised. Amelie's lip trembled and she squeezed my hand. Mommy, I thought medicine was bad, she asked. Honey, what are you talking about? Daddy said it makes me sicker. Her eyes filled with tears. He said if I stop taking it, you won't cry so much anymore. I held her while she fell asleep, then ran to the bathroom and screamed into a towel until my throat was raw. I was on my way to pick her up from the hospital when Michael's receptionist called sobbing. I heard Michael tell his wife Lauren that Amelie's college fund would cover their new baby's private school after everything resolves itself. He'd said it over dinner, while looking at beach house listings, while Amelie was having seizures from the tumor pressing on her brain. I recorded it, she continued, on my phone. I pretended I was playing Candy Crush. When I got to Amelie's room, her bed was empty. The fourth pole stood abandoned. Her stuffed bear was on the pillow, but she was gone. Where is she? I grabbed the first nurse I saw. I thought you knew. Her father signed her out an hour ago. He said you were meeting him. I walked out before she could finish. I still don't remember driving to the park. I just remember seeing them by the purple slides. Amelie was in her hospital gown with Michael's jacket around her shoulders, looking so small. He was kneeling in front of her, holding both her hands. Daddy was just saying goodbye, Amelie said when she saw me. Her voice was confused, lost. He said he won't see me again because I'm going to heaven soon. Michael stood up slowly. She deserved to hear it from me, not some doctor. She's 8 years old. She's dying. He said it so casually. The insurance papers are in my car. You'll need to sign them eventually. Lauren's pregnant again. We need to plan for our future. I took Amelie back to the hospital. But first, we made one stop. To see someone Michael thought was dead. Someone who'd been waiting 8 years to destroy him. I drove straight back to the hospital with Amelie curled up in the passenger seat, still wearing Michael's jacket over her hospital gown. She didn't say anything the whole drive, and I didn't know what to tell her, so I just held her hand at every red light. When we got back to her floor, I walked up to the nurse's station and asked to speak with the charge nurse right away. The woman behind the desk looked at Amelie and then at me and picked up the phone. 5 minutes later, a tall nurse with gray hair pulled back in a bun came out and introduced herself as the charge nurse. I asked if we could talk somewhere private, and she led us to a small office near the medication room. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I tried to explain what happened at the park. I told her Michael signed Amelie out without telling me, that I found them at the playground, that he told our 8-year-old daughter she was going to heaven soon because she's dying. The nurse's face changed from professional concern to something harder when I said that last part. She asked me to repeat exactly what Michael said, and I did, word for word, watching her expression get darker. She stood up and said she needed to document this immediately and call security. I sat in that tiny office trying not to fall apart while she typed notes into Amelie's chart on the computer. She kept asking me questions about the timeline, about what Michael said, about whether he'd done anything like this before. Within 20 minutes, a security supervisor showed up, a big guy in a Navy uniform with a radio clipped to his belt. He sat down across from me with a clipboard and took my formal statement about the unauthorized discharge and everything Michael said to Amelie. He asked if I felt Amelie was in danger, and I said yes, that her father has a life insurance policy on her, and he's been interfering with her medical treatment. The supervisor wrote everything down and said he was flagging this case for immediate review. The charge nurse told me she was adding security alerts to Amelie's chart, and that going forward no one could discharge her or discuss her case without my written permission. I thanked her and took Amelie back to her room where the bed was still empty from when Michael signed her out hours ago. The stuffed bear was still on the pillow where she'd left it. I helped Amelie change out of the hospital gown into clean pajamas and tucked her into bed with the bear. She looked up at me with those big eyes and asked if she was really going to heaven soon like Daddy said. My throat closed up, but I made myself answer. I told her no, that we were fighting hard to keep her here with me, that the medicine was helping her brain get better, that Daddy was very wrong to say those things to her. She asked the same question 2 more times in different ways, and each time I explained that her doctors were working to make her better, that I wasn't going to let anything bad happen to her. Finally, she fell asleep holding the bear, and I sat there watching her breathe for a long time. Once I was sure she was really asleep, I stepped into the hallway and pulled out my phone. I called Jonas, the lawyer who handled my divorce, and it went straight to voicemail. My voice cracked as I left a message explaining everything. The life insurance policy, Michael interfering with appointments, him telling Amelie she's dying, and then I said the words out loud for the first time. I think my ex-husband is trying to kill our daughter for money. I hung up and leaned against the wall in the hallway feeling sick. A nurse I didn't recognize walked by and asked if I was okay, and I lied and said yes. She came back a few minutes later with a notebook and a pen, and told me sometimes it helps to write things down. I went back to Amelie's room and sat in the chair by her bed and started writing. I couldn't sleep anyway, so I wrote down everything that had happened in the past few weeks. Every canceled appointment with dates and times. Every strange comment Michael made. The timing of when Amelie's symptoms got worse and when she'd been with Michael. The insurance policy details my lawyer had told me about. The recording Faith made of Michael and Lauren talking about using Amelie's college fund for their new baby's private school. I filled up pages and pages, my handwriting getting messier as my hand cramped, but I kept going. At 6 in the morning, my phone rang and I jumped. It was Jonas calling me back. I was still awake, still adding notes to my timeline. He listened to everything without interrupting while I explained the whole situation, and when I finished, there was a long pause before he spoke. He said we needed to file an emergency motion to modify custody immediately, and that he was going to contact a family law specialist who handles cases involving medical decision-making disputes. He told me to send him photos of everything I'd written down and any other documentation I had. Before 7, I called my sister Janet and asked if Amelie and I could stay with her for a while because I didn't feel safe going back to my apartment. I didn't explain why, and Janet didn't ask questions. She just said to come over whenever we got discharged, and that she was already making up the guest room. I felt something loosen in my chest, knowing we'd have somewhere safe to go. That morning, a woman in business casual clothes knocked on Amelie's door and introduced herself as Willow Masterson, the hospital social worker. She explained that security had flagged Amelie's case for review, and she needed to ask me some questions. We sat in the chairs by Amelie's bed while she slept, and Willow asked careful questions about my relationship with Michael, about who had custody, about whether I felt Amelie was safe during his visits. I answered everything honestly, showing her my timeline and explaining about the insurance policy and the interference with treatment. I tried not to sound crazy or dramatic, but my voice kept shaking. Willow took notes on a tablet and her face stayed neutral, but I could tell she was taking this seriously. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She told me she was required to file a report with CPS because there were concerns about a parent interfering with a child's necessary medical treatment. She assured me the report was about Michael's behavior, not mine, but I know how CPS investigations work. I know they can go anywhere once they start. I nodded and said I understood even though I wanted to throw up. Right before lunch, another person showed up, a man in a suit carrying a tablet. He introduced himself as Van Gillespie from the hospital risk management and sat down with a very serious expression. He explained that the hospital takes patient safety extremely seriously and that they were opening an internal investigation into how Michael was able to sign Amelie out without proper authorization and who made that call to the department head canceling her appointments. I felt relief wash over me that someone was finally taking this seriously, that it wasn't just me seeing the pattern anymore. I pulled out my phone and opened the recording Faith had sent me. Van watched as I found it in my messages and turned the volume up. Michael's voice came through first, casual like he was discussing weekend plans. He told Lauren that once everything resolved itself with Amelie, her college fund would cover private school for their new baby. Lauren laughed and said something about looking at bigger houses. Van's face stayed neutral through the first listen, but I watched his jaw muscles get tighter. When it finished, he asked me to play it again. The second time through, he took notes on his tablet, and I could see his hand gripping the stylus harder when Michael said the part about the timeline. Van looked up at me when it ended and asked if he could send this to the hospital's legal team. I nodded, and he asked if my lawyer had a copy too. I told him Jonas had the original, and Van made a note of that. He said the legal team would want to review it as part of their investigation into Michael's interference with Amelie's care. Van set his tablet down and explained that the hospital was putting new rules in place right now. Going forward, only I could authorize Amelie's discharge from the hospital. Nobody else could sign her out or make changes to her treatment plan without my written permission. He said they were flagging Michael's name in their system, so that if he tried to access Amelie's records or visit her floor, security would be notified right away. Van told me that if Michael wanted to see Amelie while she was admitted here, the hospital would require supervised visits only. A staff member would need to be present the entire time. I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in days. Van said these protections would stay in place for as long as Emily was receiving treatment at this hospital. He asked if I had any questions, and I just shook my head because I was trying not to cry from relief. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with an email from Jonas. The subject line said emergency motion draft, and my hands started shaking before I even opened it. The document was 12 pages long and laid out everything in careful legal language. The insurance policy worth $500,000 that doubled to $1 million if Emily died before age 10 from terminal illness. The 3 canceled appointments, and how someone claiming to be family had called the hospital to interfere. Michael's conversation with Emily at the park about her going to heaven soon. Faith's recording of Michael and Lauren discussing Emily's college fund paying for their new baby's private school. Jonas was asking the court to give me sole medical decision-making authority for Emily. Seeing it all written out like this made it feel more real and more scary at the same time. The motion used words like financial conflict of interest and psychological harm and medical neglect. I read through it twice and felt sick both times. Jonas had attached a note asking me to review it and let him know if anything needed changes before he filed it with the court. Casey stopped by Emily's room during her evening shift. She closed the door most of the way and sat down in the chair next to me. She spoke quietly and told me she'd done some digging about that call to the department head. The person who called had claimed to be family and had detailed information about Emily's case. They knew her diagnosis, her treatment history, the names of her doctors. The department head was horrified now that he'd canceled appointments based on an anonymous tip without checking who was actually calling. Casey said the department head had filed his own report about what happened and was cooperating fully with the hospital's investigation. She squeezed my hand before she left and told me she was sorry she hadn't caught this sooner. I found Van in the hallway the next morning and asked him about getting phone records for that call to the department head. He said the hospital was already working on it and should have the records within a few days. Then he mentioned something that made me stop walking. The hospital was considering filing their own report about Michael's interference with Emily's treatment. Van explained that what Michael had done could potentially rise to the level of medical neglect or abuse. A parent deliberately interfering with a child's cancer treatment was serious enough that the hospital had an obligation to report it. He said the decision would be made by their legal team within the next week, but that I should be prepared for that possibility. That night after Emily fell asleep, I sat in the chair by her bed and stared at my phone for 20 minutes. Jonas had tracked down a number for April Robinson and sent it to me that afternoon. I typed out a message asking if she would be willing to talk to me about Michael. I explained that I thought he was doing to our daughter what he'd done to her 8 years ago. My finger hovered over the send button for a long time before I finally pressed it. I didn't know if she would respond, or if the number even still worked. I set my phone down and tried not to think about what Michael had done that was bad enough to make someone disappear completely from his life. My phone buzzed less than an hour later. April's response was short and careful. She said she would meet me, but only in a public place with other people around. I suggested a coffee shop near the hospital, and she agreed to tomorrow afternoon at 2. I thanked her, and she didn't respond again. I spent the rest of the night lying awake in the recliner chair next to Emily's bed. I kept wondering what Michael had done to April. What kind of thing makes someone feel like they need to fake their death and start over somewhere new? What kind of person does something that makes another person that afraid? I already knew Michael was capable of terrible things, but April's fear even now, after 8 years, made me realize there was probably more I didn't know yet. CPS showed up the next morning without calling first. A woman in business clothes knocked on Emily's door and introduced herself as Alyssa Royce. She had a tablet and a folder and a calm professional voice that made me instantly nervous. She explained that she needed to interview me separately from Emily and asked if we could talk in a private room. We went to a small office down the hall and Alyssa asked me to sit down. She started with basic questions about my relationship with Michael and our custody arrangement. Then she asked about Emily's medical history and whether I'd ever felt threatened by Michael. I tried to answer everything clearly without sounding hysterical or dramatic. Alyssa took notes on her tablet and her face stayed neutral the whole time. She didn't react to anything I said, which made it hard to tell if she believed me or thought I was crazy. I showed Alyssa my timeline with all the dates and details I'd written down. She looked through it carefully and asked questions about specific entries. Then I played Faith's recording for her and watched her face finally shift a little when she heard Michael discussing Emily's college fund. I pulled up the insurance policy documents Jonas had sent me and showed her those too. Alyssa asked me to send her copies of everything, and I did it right there while we sat together. She told me she would be interviewing Michael and Lauren separately within the next few days. Then she said she also needed to interview Emily with a child specialist present and asked if that would be okay. I said yes, even though the thought of Emily being questioned made me want to throw up. Alyssa brought in another woman who specialized in talking to kids, and they took Emily to a different room. I had to wait in the hallway and I paced back and forth for 40 minutes trying not to panic. When they finally came back out, Emily looked tired, but okay. The specialist took her back to her room while Alyssa stayed to talk to me. She said Emily had clearly told them what her father said to her at the park about going to heaven soon. Alyssa's voice was still professional, but I could hear something different in it now. She told me she was noting concerns about potential psychological harm in her preliminary assessment. She said she would have her full report completed within 2 weeks, and that she'd be in touch before then if she needed anything else from me. The next afternoon, I drove to the coffee shop near the hospital and found April already sitting at a corner table with her back against the wall. She looked exactly like the photo Jonas had found, but older somehow, with lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 8 years ago. Her gaze kept jumping to the door every time someone walked in. I sat down across from her and watched her hands shake slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. She started talking before I could say anything. Michael had taken out a life insurance policy on her when they were engaged and told her it was normal financial planning for couples. She didn't think much about it until she got sick with what doctors thought might be cancer. Suddenly, Michael was very interested in her test results and kept suggesting she skip the aggressive treatment options her doctors recommended. He talked about quality of life and not putting herself through unnecessary suffering. April's voice stayed flat as she explained how Michael researched hospice care before she even had a confirmed diagnosis. When her tests came back benign, the relief lasted about 2 days before Michael's whole attitude shifted. He became distant and cold, started picking fights over nothing, seemed almost angry that she was healthy. April got suspicious and started going through his emails when he left his laptop open. She found messages between Michael and his financial advisor discussing the insurance payout timeline. They talked about what Michael would do with the money, like her death was already certain. The emails used phrases like after everything resolves itself and once the waiting period ends. Michael had been planning his future around her dying and the money he would collect. April pulled a manila envelope from her bag and slid it across the table. Inside were printed emails from 8 years ago that she'd kept in a safety deposit box all this time. I read through them and felt sick because the language was almost identical to what Faith had recorded. Michael discussing paying off his student loans with the insurance money. Michael talking about buying a house once the claim processed. Michael calculating how long he'd need to wait before the payout would come through. He wrote about April's prognosis like it was a business projection. I asked April why she didn't go to the police back then. She explained that she was 23 and scared, and Michael had already started telling people she was having a mental breakdown from the cancer scare. He convinced her friends and family that she was being paranoid and irrational. By the time she found the emails, she didn't think anyone would believe her. She got a restraining order, changed her name from April Morrison to April Robinson, moved across the country, and spent 8 years looking over her shoulder waiting for Michael to find her. April's hands were shaking harder now, but she looked directly at me. She said she couldn't let Michael do to a child what he tried to do to her. She would provide a sworn statement to Jonas detailing everything, including the insurance policy and the medical interference. I started crying right there in the coffee shop, because finally someone believed me, and I had proof this wasn't in my head. April reached across the table and squeezed my hand once before pulling back. I took photos of every email with my phone, and then put the originals back in the envelope for April to give to Jonas. We sat there for another 20 minutes while April told me about the other things Michael had done. How he isolated her from friends by making them think she was unstable. How he controlled information about her medical appointments. How he made her feel crazy for questioning his motives. I recognized every single tactic because he'd tried versions of them with me during the divorce. I drove straight from the coffee shop to Jonas's office and gave him April's contact information. Jonas called her while I sat there, and they arranged for her to come in the next morning to provide her statement. He said he would file the emergency motion that afternoon, and we should have a hearing date within 2 weeks. Jonas explained that 10 days was actually fast for family court, but I couldn't imagine waiting that long while watching Michael's supervised visits. Every time he looked at Amelie now, I could see him calculating timelines and payout schedules. 3 days later, a thick packet arrived from the insurance company after Jonas requested the full policy file. I spread all the documents across Janet's kitchen table and got on a video call with Jonas to go through them page by page. That's when we found the writer I didn't know existed. The policy paid out early for terminal diagnoses in children under 10, even if the child was still alive. Michael could potentially collect $500,000 just based on Amelie's diagnosis without her actually dying. Jonas went quiet for a long moment before telling me he was contacting the insurance company's fraud investigation unit immediately. He sent them everything we had, including Faith's recording, April's statement, and the timeline showing Michael's interference with treatment. The investigator who called back 2 hours later sounded genuinely disturbed by what Jonas had sent. She said they were opening a formal case and would be conducting their own investigation. Then she warned that insurance fraud investigations typically take months, and that wouldn't help us in family court right now. I thanked her anyway because at least someone else was looking into Michael's actions. Van from the hospital risk management called that same afternoon with news about the phone number that made the anonymous call to the department head. They'd traced it back to Michael's office landline. Van said the department head was mortified that he'd canceled Amelie's appointments based on an anonymous tip without verifying the source. The hospital had filed an internal incident report and was now documenting this as a formal case of family interference with patient care. Van explained they were building a comprehensive record of every way Michael had tried to disrupt Amelie's treatment. I added that information to my timeline and watched the evidence pile up across multiple systems. The hospital had their investigation. CPS had their assessment. The insurance company had their fraud case. Jonas had his emergency motion. April had her statement about Michael's prior pattern. Every institution that touched our lives was now documenting what Michael had done. Dr. Morrison called me into her office the next morning and spread my timeline across her desk alongside Amelie's medical charts. She traced her finger along the dates I'd marked when Amelie's symptoms got worse and compared them to Michael's custody weekends. Her expression shifted from professional concern to something darker as the pattern became clear. She picked up her phone and called the lab to order an immediate medication compliance check, explaining that she needed to see Amelie's drug levels from blood samples taken over the past 3 months. The results came back 2 hours later while I sat in her office trying not to throw up. Amelie's medication levels were way too low during several periods, which meant someone wasn't giving her the full doses she needed. Dr. Morrison pulled up the dates on her computer, and every single low reading matched up with times when Michael had custody. I felt like the room was spinning as I realized what this meant. Michael hadn't just been telling Amelie that medicine made her sicker, He'd actually been skipping doses or giving her less than prescribed. Dr. Morrison's face went completely white when I told her about Michael's comments to Emily about the medicine. She started typing fast into Emily's chart, documenting everything about suspected medication tampering, and then she picked up her phone to call CPS directly. I watched her explain the lab results to whoever answered, her voice getting sharper as she described the pattern of subtherapeutic levels matching Michael's custody time. She hung up and told me she was sending a formal report to CPS that same day, and that this was now documented as potential medical abuse. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived from Michael's lawyer. I opened it standing in Janet's kitchen, and my hands started shaking as I read the letter, demanding that I stop making false allegations against Michael, and threatening to sue me for defamation. The letter claimed I was engaged in parental alienation, and that my behavior was damaging Michael's reputation in the community. I took a photo of every page and sent them to Jonas, then sat down at the table because my legs felt too weak to hold me up. Jonas called back within an hour and said he was already drafting a response. He spent 20 minutes on the phone listing every piece of evidence we had: the insurance policy, Faith's recordings, April's statement, the hospital documentation, the medication compliance report, the phone records showing Michael's calls to the department head. Jonas said he was going to lay it all out in his response letter, and note that truth is an absolute defense to defamation, which meant Michael would have to prove our allegations were false. He told me not to worry about the threat because Michael's lawyer was just trying to scare me into backing down. We didn't hear anything back from Michael's lawyer for 3 days after Jonas sent his response. A package arrived at Jonas's office from April with a return address in another state. Jonas called me to come look at it before he opened it because it was marked as evidence. I drove straight there and watched him cut through the tape on a medium-sized cardboard box. Inside were file folders stuffed with papers, a USB drive, printed emails, text messages, and a leather journal with dates written on the cover from 8 years ago. April had included a note explaining that this was everything she'd kept from her relationship with Michael, including the original insurance policy he'd taken out on her. Jonas pulled on gloves before touching anything, and started going through the documents one by one. The insurance policy was almost identical to the one Michael had on Emily. Same company, same type of coverage, same payout structure for terminal illness. The printed emails showed Michael discussing future financial plans with his advisor that assumed April's death, talking about paying off debts and buying property. The journal entries documented Michael's behavior during April's cancer scare, how he discouraged her from seeking treatment, how he talked about quality of life versus quantity just like Lauren had said to me about Emily. Jonas looked up from the papers and said this established a clear pattern of predatory financial planning. He said he was going to use all of this to argue that Michael represented an active danger to Emily, and that his behavior wasn't impulsive, but calculated and repeated. Alyssa from CPS showed up at Janet's house 2 days later, asking if we could talk again. This time her questions were different, more specific and pointed. She asked about Michael and Lauren's financial situation, about their new baby, about any comments they'd made regarding future plans. I told her everything. About the beach house listings Faith had mentioned in her recording, about Lauren's comment in the Starbucks parking lot regarding quality of life versus quantity, about Michael's new wife being pregnant again, and them needing money for private school. Alyssa took notes the whole time, and I watched her expression get darker and more serious as I talked. She asked me to describe exactly what Lauren had said about nature's way of saying to let go, and when I repeated the words, Alyssa actually stopped writing and just stared at me for a second. She asked if I had any evidence of Michael and Lauren discussing financial benefits related to Emily's condition, and I pulled up Faith's recording on my phone. Alyssa listened to the whole thing about the college fund paying for private school after everything resolves itself, and she asked me to email her a copy immediately. Before she left, she told me she was adding significant concerns about financial motivation to her assessment and that she'd be recommending continued monitoring of Michael's contact with Emily. Van from the hospital risk management called me that afternoon to tell me the ethics committee had held their preliminary meeting about Emily's case. He said they'd reviewed all the documentation, the medication tampering concerns, Michael's interference with appointments, his conversation with Emily about dying, and the financial conflict of interest created by the insurance policy. The committee was recommending that no changes be made to Emily's treatment plan without my explicit written consent. They were also recommending that Michael not be allowed to discuss prognosis or end-of-life issues with Emily unless a medical professional and I were both present. Van explained that these recommendations would be added to Emily's chart, and that all staff would be notified. He said the hospital was taking the position that Emily's medical care was not subject to interference from anyone with a financial interest in her death. I thanked him and hung up feeling like I could breathe a little easier, knowing the hospital was actively protecting Emily. Jonas called me the next morning, sounding angry in a way I hadn't heard before. Michael had filed his own motion with the court asking for a pause in Emily's treatment for quality of life reasons. Jonas read me parts of it over the phone, and I felt sick listening to Michael's lawyer argue that Emily was suffering unnecessarily, and that treatment was only prolonging her pain. The motion claimed that I was unable to accept Emily's prognosis, and that someone needed to advocate for her comfort over aggressive intervention. Jonas said he was filing an immediate response arguing that Michael had a direct financial conflict of interest, and that his motion was essentially asking the court to let Emily die, so he could collect insurance money. He said he was attaching every piece of evidence we had, including the insurance policy documents, the medication tampering report, April's evidence of prior pattern, and Faith's recordings. Jonas told me the judge would see right through what Michael was trying to do, but that we needed to be prepared for a fight. I was at Janet's house helping Emily with her homework when Jonas called with the news about Michael's motion. I excused myself and locked the bathroom door before answering because I didn't want Emily to hear. As Jonas explained what Michael was asking the court to do, I started screaming into a towel to muffle the sound. My whole body shook as I realized Michael was actually trying to use the legal system to stop Emily's treatment. When I finally came out of the bathroom, Janet took one look at my face and sent Emily to watch TV in the other room. I sat at the kitchen table and cried while Janet held my hand, and I couldn't stop shaking even after the tears stopped. Janet told me she was taking time off work to help me get through the court hearing. She said I wasn't going to face this alone and that she'd be there for every appointment, every meeting, every court date until this was over. Jonas called again 3 days later with news about Michael's phone records. He'd subpoenaed them and found exactly what we suspected. Multiple calls to the hospital department head's office, to Dr. Morrison's office, to the insurance company, all made from Michael's work phone during business hours. Jonas walked me through the timeline showing how Michael had been systematically interfering with Emily's care for weeks. Every canceled appointment had a corresponding call from Michael's office to someone at the hospital. Every insurance question had a logged call to the claims department. The pattern showed Michael treating Emily's medical crisis like just another item on his work to-do list, making calls between client meetings and lunch appointments. Jonas said this documentation was devastating because it proved deliberate, calculated interference rather than impulsive emotional reactions. He was adding all of it to our court filings and sending copies to CPS and the insurance fraud investigator. My phone rang from an unknown number that evening, and when I answered, Faith was crying on the other end. She apologized over and over for not coming forward sooner, saying she'd been scared of losing her job but couldn't stay silent anymore. She told me she'd been documenting everything Michael said for the past month after she realized what he was doing. Faith had recordings of Michael on the phone with the insurance company asking about payout timelines and beneficiary verification. She'd recorded him discussing with Lauren how long they thought it would take and what they'd do with the money once everything was finalized. Faith said she had hours of recordings saved on her phone and backed up to a cloud drive because she was terrified Michael would find out and delete them. She asked me where to send everything, and I gave her Jonas's contact information. After we hung up, I sat in the dark living room at Janet's house and watched Emily sleep on the couch, her chest rising and falling steadily, and I felt something shift inside me from fear to pure determination. 2 days later, Alyssa called to tell me she'd interviewed Michael and Lauren that morning. She said they came in together and asked to be interviewed as a couple, which apparently wasn't standard, but she allowed it. According to Alyssa, they showed up with a whole binder full of printed research about childhood cancer and quality of life studies. Lauren did most of the talking at first, going through articles about treatment side effects and statistics about survival rates. Michael cried when they got to the part about not wanting Emily to suffer, and he told Alyssa that I couldn't accept how sick she really was. They said I was putting Emily through painful procedures because I was in denial, and that someone needed to protect her from my need to keep fighting when there was no hope left. Alyssa let them finish their whole presentation before she started asking her own questions. She asked about the life insurance policy, and Michael said it was just responsible planning for funeral costs. She asked about the canceled appointments, and Michael said he was trying to give Emily breaks from the constant hospital visits. She asked about what he told Emily at the park, and he said she deserved honesty instead of false hope. Later that afternoon, Alyssa called me back and asked if I could meet her for coffee. I drove to the place she suggested and found her already sitting at a corner table with 2 cups in front of her. She pushed one toward me and said she needed to tell me something off the record. Alyssa said she'd been doing this job for 11 years and she'd seen parents perform before. She said Michael and Lauren's presentation felt practiced, like they'd rehearsed exactly what to say and in what order. The binder was too organized, too perfect, like they'd spent days putting it together specifically for this meeting. She told me that in her experience, parents who are genuinely concerned about their child's suffering don't bring PowerPoint presentations to CPS interviews. She said she was noting in her official report that their focus on Emily's prognosis and quality of life was concerning given the financial benefit they'd receive from her death. She also said that everything they claimed about my behavior didn't match what she'd seen in the medical records or heard from the hospital staff. Alyssa told me she couldn't promise anything about the final outcome, but she wanted me to know that she wasn't buying their performance. The next morning, Van from the hospital risk management called and asked me to come in to review some security footage. I left Emily with Janet and drove to the hospital, where Van had a conference room set up with a laptop. He showed me footage from the day Michael signed Emily out without permission. The timestamp showed Michael arriving at the nurse's station with a folder already in his hand. He wasn't empty-handed or casual. He came prepared with paperwork. The nurse at the desk looked confused and kept shaking her head, but Michael leaned forward and pointed at things in his folder. The footage didn't have sound, but I could see him getting more intense, his gestures getting bigger. The nurse finally picked up a phone and called someone. Then after a few minutes, she started typing on her computer. Michael stood there watching her the whole time with his arms crossed. Van paused the video and told me they'd interviewed that nurse as part of their investigation. She said Michael had been very insistent about his rights as Emily's father. He'd brought copies of the custody agreement and kept saying there would be problems if she didn't let him take his daughter. The nurse felt pressured and worried she'd violated his parental rights if she refused, so she processed the discharge even though something felt wrong about it. Van said the hospital was updating their policies to prevent this from happening again. That same afternoon, I got an email from Jonas with an attachment from Dr. Morrison. She'd done a full review of Emily's medical records going back 6 months, looking at medication levels and symptom patterns. Her report showed a clear pattern. During the weeks when Michael had overnight custody, Amelie's drug levels in her blood tests came back lower than they should have been. During those same periods, she had more seizures and her symptoms got worse. When I had full custody and Michael only had supervised day visits, her medication levels stayed where they were supposed to be, and her symptoms were more stable. Dr. Morrison wrote in her report that based on this evidence, she believed someone had been deliberately giving Amelie less medicine than prescribed or skipping doses entirely. She said this pattern of medication tampering could have serious consequences for Amelie's treatment outcomes and brain function. The report stated clearly that she suspected medical neglect and possible abuse. I sat at Janet's kitchen table reading the report 3 times, feeling sick. Michael had been poisoning our daughter by withholding her medicine, making her sicker on purpose so she'd die faster. Jonas called that evening with more news from the insurance company investigator. They'd been digging into how the policy was issued in the first place and found major problems with Michael's application. He'd applied for the coverage right after Amelie's diagnosis, but before the doctors had given us a clear prognosis. On the application, he'd answered questions about her health condition in ways that made it sound much less serious than it actually was. He left out information about the tumor size and location. He didn't mention that the doctors had used words like aggressive and high risk. If the insurance company had known the truth about how sick Amelie really was, they never would have issued the policy at all. The investigator said this was textbook insurance fraud, and they were building a case. The next morning, Jonas forwarded me an email that the investigator had sent him. It was a copy of something Michael had sent to the insurance company 2 weeks earlier. The subject line said question about accelerated benefits, and the email asked about getting money early for terminal diagnosis cases. Michael wanted to know what paperwork he'd need to file and how long the payout process would take. He asked if there were any restrictions on how the money could be used once it was paid out. The whole email read like he was planning a business deal, not talking about his daughter dying. The timestamp on the email was from the same day he took Amelie to the park and told her she was going to heaven soon. He'd spent that morning emailing about collecting her life insurance money, then spent the afternoon telling her goodbye. I threw up in Janet's bathroom after reading it. Faith called me later that week and said she had more evidence to send Jonas. She'd seen Michael's phone sitting on his desk while he was in a meeting, and she'd looked through his text messages with Lauren. She took photos of the conversation with her own phone. The texts showed them discussing when they could start looking at bigger houses. Lauren had written that they just needed to wait for everything to resolve itself first. Michael responded that it shouldn't be much longer based on how things were going with Amelie's health. They talked about which neighborhoods had the best schools for their baby, and whether they should get a 4-bedroom or 5-bedroom house. The texts were from 3 days after Michael had told Amelie she was dying. Faith sent everything to Jonas, and he added it to our growing file of evidence. Then Michael's lawyer filed a new motion with the court. Jonas called to tell me that Michael was asking the judge to order both of us to get evaluated by psychologists. The motion claimed I was showing signs of crazy thinking and trying to turn Amelie against her father. Jonas said this was a common move when one side was losing. They try to make everything messy and confusing so nobody knows what to believe. He told me not to worry because he'd already set up an appointment for me with Dr. Chen, who was a well-known psychologist that specialized in custody cases. Jonas said Dr. Chen was fair and smart and would see through Michael's games. I met with Dr. Chen the following Tuesday at her office downtown. She had me fill out a bunch of forms and questionnaires first. Then we talked for over 3 hours. She asked about my childhood, my marriage to Michael, the divorce, how I handled stress, my relationship with Amelie. She asked specific questions about everything that had happened with Michael's interference in Amelie's treatment. I showed her my timeline, Faith's recordings, the medical reports, everything. Dr. Chen didn't react much while I talked. She just took notes and asked follow-up questions. She had me do some tests on a computer that measured things like attention and memory. At the end, she told me she'd write up her report and send it to Jonas and the court. She said I'd presented everything clearly and calmly despite the horrible situation I was dealing with. I left her office feeling like maybe I'd done okay, like maybe someone else could see I wasn't crazy or dramatic. 2 days after my evaluation, Van called with news from the hospital ethics committee. They'd finished their first review of Amelie's case and issued their initial findings. The committee recommended that any contact between Michael and Amelie needed to happen with medical staff present to supervise. They said Michael should not be allowed to talk to Amelie about dying or end-of-life topics without both a doctor and me being there. The report cited the psychological damage caused by what Michael said to her at the park. It also pointed to the pattern of medical interference that was documented throughout her chart. Van said these recommendations would be sent to the court and to CPS as part of the ongoing investigations. 2 days later, April walked into Jonas's office carrying a manila envelope and a small external hard drive. She sat across from his desk and slid both items toward him with shaking hands. The affidavit was notarized and detailed everything from 8 years ago. The insurance policy Michael took out on her, how he interfered with her doctor appointments, how his whole attitude changed when her test results came back benign. She'd kept copies of emails where he discussed what he'd do with the insurance money before she even got her diagnosis. The backup drive had everything. Screenshots of text messages, voicemails he'd left, photos of the policy documents. Jonas read through the affidavit twice while April sat there picking at her fingernails. He looked up and told her this was exactly what we needed. Her testimony showed Michael's pattern, proved this wasn't a one-time thing with Amelie. It established his modus operandi in a way that would destroy his credibility in court. April asked if she'd have to testify in person, and Jonas said probably not for the emergency hearing, but maybe later. She nodded and left quickly, still looking over her shoulder in the parking lot. The emergency hearing arrived on a cold Tuesday morning, and I sat in family court next to Jonas with my hands folded so tight my knuckles went white. Michael walked in with his lawyer wearing a navy suit and that same calm expression he always had in court. Lauren wasn't there, but I could feel her presence in every confident step he took. The judge called the hearing to order, and Michael's lawyer stood up first. He painted a picture of me as an overprotective mother who couldn't accept reality. He said I was in denial about Amelie's prognosis, that I was putting her through unnecessary suffering because I couldn't let go. He called the insurance policy responsible financial planning that any good parent would do. He suggested I was twisting innocent actions into something sinister because I was emotional and irrational. Michael sat there nodding along, playing the concerned father who just wanted his daughter's suffering to end. The lawyer talked for 20 minutes and I wanted to scream, but Jonas squeezed my arm under the table. Jonas stood up and started laying out our evidence piece by piece. He began with the insurance policy and the accelerated benefits rider that would pay out even if Amelie didn't die. He entered Faith's recordings into evidence, the audio of Michael and Lauren discussing beach houses and private schools while Amelie was having seizures. He presented hospital documentation showing the pattern of interference, the canceled appointments, the unauthorized discharge. He showed Dr. Morrison's medication compliance report proving Amelie's drug levels dropped during Michael's custody time. He read sections of April's affidavit out loud, her account of Michael taking out a policy on her and hoping she'd die. He showed Michael's emails to the insurance company asking about payout timelines the same day he told Amelie she was going to heaven. The judge's face changed as each piece went into the record. She started out neutral, but her expression got tighter with every document Jonas presented. She leaned forward when he played Faith's recording, and I saw her write something down with hard strokes of her pen. Michael's lawyer tried to recover by attacking me directly. He pointed out that I was clearly emotional and stressed, that my judgment was clouded by fear. He suggested I was making connections that weren't there, seeing conspiracies where there was only a father trying to make hard decisions about his dying daughter. Jonas stood up before the lawyer even finished sitting down. He said any parent would be distressed when they discovered their child's other parent had $1 million financial reason to want that child dead. He said my protective behavior wasn't pathological. It was appropriate given the documented evidence of interference and manipulation. The judge actually nodded and I saw Michael's face go red. His lawyer tried to object, but the judge held up her hand and told him she'd heard enough. The judge flipped through the documents on her desk and then looked directly at Michael. She said the evidence presented raised serious concerns about his motivation and judgment. She issued a temporary order giving me sole medical decision-making authority for Amelie effective immediately. Michael's lawyer started to protest, but she kept talking. She ordered that Michael's visits must be supervised by a court-approved monitor. She said he could not discuss Amelie's prognosis or death with her under any circumstances. She ordered him to stay at least 500 feet away from Amelie's medical providers and not to contact them for any reason. Michael's jaw clenched, but he didn't say anything. His lawyer scribbled notes furiously. The judge wasn't done. She ordered psychological evaluations of both parents to be completed within 30 days. She scheduled a follow-up hearing for 6 weeks out after the evaluations were finished. She noted on the record that the pattern of behavior documented in the evidence showed a fundamental inability to prioritize Amelie's well-being over financial interests. She said Amelie's medical care would continue uninterrupted under my authority, and that any violation of her orders would result in contempt charges. She banged her gavel and Michael walked out without looking at me. I sat there shaking while Jonas packed up his files. The insurance company called Jonas that afternoon while I was driving home. Their investigator said they were officially freezing the policy pending the outcome of their fraud investigation. Michael couldn't make any beneficiary changes, and no claims could be paid out regardless of what happened. The investigator explained this was standard procedure when there were credible allegations of insurance fraud involving a minor. Jonas asked how long the investigation would take, and the investigator said probably 3 to 6 months. He said they were treating this as a priority case given that a child's life was potentially at stake. Jonas thanked him and called me right after to explain what this meant. Michael's whole plan was falling apart. Van from the hospital called the next morning to go over new protocols they were putting in place for Amelie's care. The hospital had formalized everything in writing. There was now an approved list of people who could discuss her case, and I had to approve any additions. Any visitors had to be approved by me in writing before they could see her. They'd put a flag in their computer system that would alert security automatically if Michael tried to access her records or enter her floor. Van said these protections would stay in place for the duration of her treatment, and possibly longer depending on how the court case went. He sounded relieved, like the hospital had been waiting for legal cover to do what they knew was right. Dr. Morrison asked to meet with me that same week to discuss Amelie's progress. We sat in her office and she pulled up charts on her computer showing Amelie's medication levels over the past 3 months. Since I got sole custody and Michael stopped having unsupervised time, Amelie's drug levels had been consistently in the right range. Her symptoms had started to stabilize. The seizures were less frequent. Her cognitive function was improving. Dr. Morrison said she was cautiously optimistic that the treatment was working better now that Amelie was getting her full doses consistently. She pulled up scans showing the tumor and explained that while it was still there, it wasn't growing as fast as it had been during the periods when Michael had custody. She couldn't promise anything long-term, but she said this was real progress. My psychological evaluation results arrived by email 2 days later. I opened the PDF with my hands shaking, terrified of what Dr. Chen might have written. The report was 12 pages long, and I skimmed through looking for the conclusion. Dr. Chen wrote that I was functioning within normal limits with situational distress appropriate to my circumstances. She said my concerns about Michael were well-founded based on the documented evidence I'd provided. She noted that my protective behavior toward Amelie was appropriate parenting, given the credible threat to her safety, not pathological anxiety or delusional thinking. She wrote that I demonstrated clear thinking, appropriate emotional regulation, and strong maternal instinct. I read that paragraph 3 times and then called Janet, crying with relief. Michael's evaluation results arrived 3 weeks after mine. Jonas forwarded me the report, and I read it sitting in my car outside Janet's house because I didn't want Amelie to see my face while I processed it. The evaluator wrote that Michael showed narcissistic personality traits with limited capacity for empathy. She noted that he rationalized his behavior with Amelie by framing everything through how it affected him financially and socially. The report said Michael viewed Amelie's illness primarily as a burden on his resources and future planning, rather than a tragedy happening to his child. She documented how he spoke about Amelie's prognosis with detachment, like discussing a business problem that needed solving. The evaluator recommended supervised visitation only, and stated that Michael's financial conflict of interest created serious concerns about his, to make decisions in Amelie's best interest. I sent the report to Janet and she called me immediately. We didn't need to say much, just sat on the phone together while I cried in the parking lot. April met with Alyssa from CPS the following week at a neutral location. Jonas arranged it and April brought her box of evidence from 8 years ago. She spent 2 hours explaining Michael's pattern of behavior, how he isolated her from friends and family during her cancer scare, how he controlled what information she got from doctors, how he made her feel insane for questioning his motives. Alyssa documented everything in her case file, taking notes about how Michael's current behavior with Amelie matched his prior pattern with April. April showed Alyssa the insurance policy Michael took out on her, the emails discussing payouts, the timeline of his behavior changing when her diagnosis turned out to be benign. Alyssa asked detailed questions about how Michael reacted when April didn't die, about his financial situation at the time, about whether he showed remorse or tried to explain his actions. April said he never apologized, just acted like she was crazy for making connections that seemed obvious to her. Alyssa told April her testimony was valuable because it showed this wasn't a one-time mistake or panic response, but a calculated pattern spanning years. She said the prior bad act evidence would be included in her report, as relevant to understanding Michael's current risk level. CPS issued their preliminary report 2 weeks before the second hearing. Alyssa sent it to Jonas, who called me as soon as he finished reading it. The report recommended that custody remain with me, and that Michael's visits stay supervised pending completion of the court process. Alyssa wrote explicitly that Michael's financial conflict of interest, combined with his documented interference with Amelie's medical care, created an unacceptable risk to her safety and well-being. She cited the insurance policy, Faith's recordings, the hospital documentation, April's prior experience, and Michael's own psychological evaluation. The report noted that Michael showed no insight into how his behavior harmed Amelie emotionally and continued to frame his actions as protective rather than dangerous. Alyssa recommended that any future contact between Michael and Amelie include therapeutic supervision to address the psychological damage from his conversation about death at the park. She also recommended that the court consider whether Michael's pattern of behavior warranted a referral for criminal investigation. Jonas said this was the strongest CPS recommendation he'd seen in a case like this, that Alyssa clearly understood what Michael was doing and wasn't buying his concerned father act. The second court hearing happened 6 weeks after the first. I sat next to Jonas in the same courtroom with the same judge, but this time the table in front of us was covered with reports and evidence. The judge had both psychological evaluations, the CPS report, the hospital ethics committee findings, and the insurance company's preliminary fraud investigation results. Michael's lawyer stood up and tried to argue that Michael was being unfairly characterized, that he was a loving father making difficult decisions about his daughter's quality of life. The judge cut him off and asked if he'd read Dr. Chen's evaluation of Michael. His lawyer said yes, but that personality traits don't make someone a bad parent. The judge picked up Alyssa's CPS report and read the section about financial conflict of interest out loud. She asked Michael's lawyer how he explained the insurance policy combined with the interference with treatment. He said the policy was responsible planning, and the treatment concerns were legitimate medical questions. The judge then read from the hospital ethics committee report about Michael telling Amelie she was going to heaven soon. She asked what legitimate medical purpose that conversation served. Michael's lawyer didn't have a good answer. The judge looked at Michael directly and asked if he understood why multiple professional evaluators were concerned about his behavior. Michael started to respond, but she held up her hand and said she'd read enough. The judge made the temporary orders permanent without much discussion. She gave me sole legal and physical custody with Michael having supervised visitation only. She stated on the record that Michael's pattern of behavior demonstrated a fundamental inability to prioritize Amelie's well-being over his financial interests. She said his contact with Amelie must be monitored to ensure her safety, and that the supervision requirement would remain in place indefinitely. She ordered Michael to complete a parenting course focused on medical decision-making, and to undergo ongoing therapy to address the issues identified in his evaluation. She also ordered that Michael pay for the cost of supervised visitation, and that he have no contact with Amelie's medical providers. Michael's face went red and he started to stand up, but his lawyer pulled him back down. The judge looked at him and said she was considering whether to refer the case to law enforcement, but wanted to see the insurance company's final investigation results first. We walked out of the courthouse and I sat on a bench outside and just breathed for the first time in months. The insurance company completed their investigation a month later. Their investigator called Jonas and explained they'd determined that Michael committed fraud in the application process by misrepresenting Emily's condition. He'd applied for the policy right after her diagnosis, but answered questions about her prognosis in ways that made it seem less serious than it was. He'd also failed to disclose that doctors had already recommended aggressive treatment, which would have made the policy uninsurable at that coverage level. The investigator said they were voiding the policy entirely, and that no benefits would ever be paid out regardless of what happened to Emily. They were also referring the case to the state insurance fraud unit for potential criminal charges. Jonas explained that insurance fraud involving a child could result in felony charges if the prosecutor decided to pursue it. He said the prosecutor would likely wait to see how Emily's case progressed, and whether Michael's interference had caused lasting harm. I didn't care about criminal charges at that point. I just cared that Michael's financial incentive was gone, and he couldn't hurt Emily anymore. 3 months after that day at the park, Emily and I settled into a new routine. She was responding well to treatment now that she was getting consistent medication. We still had hard days when the medicine made her sick, or when she was tired from appointments. But she wasn't having the severe symptoms she'd had when Michael was interfering with her care. Her seizures were less frequent. She could focus better. She was laughing again. We started talking about things she wanted to do next summer. She wanted to go to the beach and learn to swim. She wanted to get a dog. She wanted to have a sleepover with her friends from the school. I let myself hope that we'd have that time together. Dr. Morrison was cautiously optimistic that the tumor was responding to treatment, and that with continued compliance we might see real progress. I took Emily to every appointment and gave her every dose of medicine exactly as prescribed. Janet came with us to the heart appointments and sat with Emily when I needed to talk to doctors alone. We were building something stable. Faith quit her job with Michael and moved to a different company. She sent me updates occasionally about how things were going in Michael's professional circle. Apparently word got around about the custody case and several of his colleagues distanced themselves from him. People who used to go to lunch with him stopped inviting him. Clients started requesting different account managers. His new wife Lauren had been noticeably absent from his office since the final hearing. Faith heard through the office that Lauren was upset about the insurance policy being voided, and that she'd been pushing Michael to appeal the custody decision. Faith said Michael looked stressed every time she saw him around town, that he'd aged 10 years in 3 months. I didn't feel bad for him. I felt nothing when I thought about him except relief that he couldn't touch Emily anymore. I sat with Emily in her hospital room during her regular treatment when she asked if Daddy was telling the truth about heaven. She was coloring in a book Janet had brought her, not looking up when she asked. I put down my phone and moved my chair closer to her bed. I told her honestly that Daddy was wrong, that we were fighting hard and the medicine was working. I said we were going to have a lot more time together. She looked up at me then and smiled. She asked if we could really get a dog next summer. I said yes, we could get a dog. She went back to her coloring book and I watched her for a while. Her hand was steady. Her color was better. She looked like a kid again instead of someone carrying weight too heavy for her small shoulders. I realized that for the first time in months, I actually believed what I was telling her. We were going to be okay. Not perfect, not easy, but okay. That was enough. And that's today's takeaway. I like turning small stories into something you can actually use or think about. If this sparked an idea or a little reminder, that's a win. Subscribe so you'll catch the next one when it drops.